Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of Dinner with Jesus. This is the Bible podcast that's about the Bible. Each week we take a story that's been told by one of the great storytellers and teachers of wisdom from all time, Jesus. And today we've got a really short story. I mean really short, but it is completely packed with great images, great ideas. We've got sights and sounds and smells today. I'm telling you, you're going to need to get your olfactory senses whipped up and ready to go. I've called this episode, Ooh, Mom, what smells so good? As we're going to get ready to go into the kitchen with a woman who apparently one day was getting ready to whip up a great meal for her kids. And Jesus uses this idea and wants to teach us something about the kingdom of heaven. That's one of his favorite things to talk about, and I'll be back in just a minute as we read and once again think about what this story might be saying to us for our lives today. Our Bible narrator, Jane Trevor, is going to be on for just a few seconds and give us the story. Take it away, Jane.
I'm reading from Matthew, chapter 13, verse 33. And Jesus told them a parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened.
I told you that was a really short story. Thanks, Jane, for reading this one single verse from us. It's actually taken from a series of short stories, and we're going to get to some of them later. But today, we're focusing on this idea of a woman who had to come in and do something that perhaps she had to do almost every day, certainly probably would have been part of her weekly routine, and that's prepare to bake bread for the family meal. Now, as we're going to see in a minute, this probably was preparation for a lot of bread, and that's kind of part of the story too. But I just want to stop and reflect for a moment on how often the story of Jesus and the stories from Jesus are centered around food. We've already talked about the connection to the name of our podcast, Dinner with Jesus. We find Jesus sitting down at the table and sharing a meal with people all the time. But there are some other connections to food when you stop and think about the life of Jesus. He taught us one of the most famous prayers. We call it the Lord's Prayer. Some people call it the Our Father. And people learn to pray this not just in church, but in other places too. We used to pray it back in the day for our football team, and I guess there are people who still do today. But in that prayer, Jesus teaches us to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." And that's a gratitude and a trust for what we're going to need to, I guess, kind of make it through the day. Interesting to note that there's a famous story about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness by the character of the devil. And the first thing that happens to Jesus in that story is he is tempted, after not eating anything for 40 days, to turn stones into bread. Some people see that as kind of a temptation about not trusting God to give him each day his daily bread, but that's not the point of today. One writer I read, kind of thinking about this story, pointed out that in the story of Jesus being born, the Christmas story, when he's born as a baby, he is placed in a manger, which is a feeding trough for animals. Of course, Jesus would grow up as a man and go on to do things like the feeding of 4,000, 5,000, as many as 10,000 people at a time in those miracle stories. Later, he is going to compare his own life and his own body to bread, which is broken and is given for his followers. He met people at the table an awful lot. And there is one story that, again, we're not getting to today, where Jesus has a very sharp dialogue with a woman who was, shall we say, not from around here. She was a Gentile woman, not a Jewish woman. And she came to ask Jesus on that day about the possibility of her daughter receiving healing, because he had quite a reputation as a healer. And Jesus says something that lots of us have taken as kind of not in keeping with his character. But he says to the woman, well, you know, it's not right to take the children's food from the table and feed it to the dogs. Now, that seems kind of a sharp way for Jesus to talk to somebody, but this woman, she stood her ground and she said back to Jesus, well, that's true, but even dogs eat scraps under the children's table. Touché. Love that story. But again, just one of the ways that Jesus is associated with food in his teachings and in his travels. In this really short story for today, I want to break down some of the elements and then kind of come back and bring it all together as we think about what might be some of the overall meanings here. We see this woman taking what the story says as yeast, translated into English. Remember, these stories are very old, and they were written originally in the Greek language from 2,000 years ago. And so this word, zume in Greek, that we call yeast is not exactly what you might think about. I can remember seeing the little red packets of Fleshman's yeast in my mom's refrigerator growing up, and you rip that open and put a little yeast into the flour and have that ready to rise and to make the homemade bread or the biscuits. That's not exactly what we're talking about here. It really is more of the whole concoction, what we might think of as a sourdough starter. You would keep a small amount of bread, which the flour and the yeast and the water would be put together, and usually the woman of the house, probably some men who baked bread, but mostly the women, and would put it in a bowl, cover it up, set it over in a dark place, maybe for a day or 2 or 3, and let that yeast begin to ferment in the flour. And that then would be used to put into other flour so that the whole concoction would be able to rise and would be able to be baked. It's fermenting. We know that this was just part of everyday culture. We see it actually in the Bible a lot. The really old stories in the Hebrew Scripture, which some people call the Old Testament, talks about putting this in the process of bringing bread to the temple to make an offering to God, to be able to make food for the priests to eat. I have read some commentators on the Bible say that, well, yeast always represents something worldly or something evil or something that's bad. And, that's just not true. Yeast and bread were very much a part of the everyday culture of the world of this time, and especially of the culture that Jesus was telling these stories in. Now, sometimes yeast can be seen, and we even see it in real life. It can be used to describe something that's not so good, or maybe something that's evil. You might say, boy, that really smells, or, whew, something's rotten in here. Kind of gives rise to phrases that we might recognize, like, be careful, one bad apple will spoil the whole bunch. It's talking about the same process of yeast as it begins to spread. But that can also be seen as something good, right? It is a fertile image. It is rich. It is like fresh baked bread when you walk in. I don't know if any of you have ever walked into the house and, your wife or your mom or maybe dad, you're the one who loves to bake fresh bread, and you just go, oh, man, that's wonderful. Or even if you can't experience it at home, go to a Subway sometime, especially early in the morning, a Subway restaurant, after they've been baking the bread for the day. Man, that smell is good. So the use of yeast depends on the context. And believe me, this all has a point, because we need to go on deeper into the context of the story Jesus is telling. Why does he give us a story of a woman getting ready to bake? Well, we know that Jesus loved to use everyday examples from life. He talked about things that people could relate to, like shepherds and sheep in some of the stories we've seen, farmers and seed, going out and doing their daily work. He talked about olive trees and crops. These are people living everyday life and just doing everyday kinds of things. So we have a woman who's faced with one of her normal daily tasks of living. Need to bake the bread. I don't know why. I'm sorry this pops in my head, but I see an old commercial from years ago with the old guy that had to get up early every day and go into his Dunkin' Donuts. He's like, time to make the donuts. Time to make the donuts. And this woman, well, it's time to get ready for the bread. So she mixes this yeast into the flour. Now, again, in English, we kind of get an image of, sort of mixing it in the bowl or pouring a little yeast in and maybe with a spoon or whatever. The word actually is a little more involved than that. It's a word for hides. She hides the yeast into the flour. Remember, we're talking about a little bit of starter dough, and so she takes that and works it in. We would say she kneads the dough, Kneads. She kneads it. I'm using a couple of Greek words today, not because I want to show off that I read a very little bit of Greek, but it gets rich for us. The word is encrypto, like encrypt. It means to bury or to hide. And so she is encrypting this wad of sourdough into this load of fresh flour. Now, Jesus often used this word in talking about the hidden things, hidden wisdom, hidden things that we need to know. And his idea was always that hidden things must be brought into the light. That which we hide, that which we bury, there will be a time when it will come forth. And so whatever this woman is doing, and remember, this is an illustration of what the kingdom work of God is like, the kingdom of heaven. Whatever she's doing is going to yield something that's going to bring light. She is working with this wonderful piece of starter batch, and she is encrypting it. She is kneading it. She is putting it into this much larger thing, which is the content of the flour. And something's going to happen. So let's talk about that flour. The text is very specific, and it says that she was using 3 measures of flour. More contemporary translation might say about 40 to 60 pounds of flour. Now, that's a lot of bread, right? This is not taking 3 or 4 cups of flour and making a recipe. This is like 60 pounds of flour, 3 measures. And you got to start to say at this point, what possible connection is there with this woman with 3 measures of flour and bringing forth something magnificent and marvelous like the kingdom of heaven? And because it's Jesus telling a story, we might well imagine that there's something unexpected that's going to arise. Jesus is an expert storyteller. He's also a rabbi, deeply steeped in the stories of his Jewish tradition. And so let's think back a little bit. to some of the stories that Jesus would have known and that his listeners that day would have known as well. There's the story of Abraham and the three visitors. You go all the way back to the book of Genesis in chapter 18, and you may or may not be familiar with this story, but these three visitors come up to Abraham. The story is generally acknowledged to depict a visit from God and two angels. And they walk up to Abraham's tent, where he proceeds to offer them food, hospitality. And he says to his wife, Sarah, hurry, go take 3 measures of flour and make some cakes. And he's going to prepare a meal to serve to these 3 visitors. Now, again, interestingly, the word for those cakes made from these 3 measures of flour is ugat in Hebrew, but it's translated over into the Septuagint, or the Greek version of the Hebrew scripture, that was read by most of the Jews in Jesus' time. Again, stick with me. I'm not trying to just throw a bunch of hobbledy-gobbledy out here, but all of these dots connect in something fascinating. In the Greek version of this Old Testament story, the word for those cakes are enkryptios. Remember, the woman is encrypto. She's encrypting this yeast into the bread, and all the way back in Sarah's time, she did the same thing by encrypting and producing these cakes. Hang on. The story with Abraham continues. Those visitors, in other words, God and the angels, tell Abraham that he and his wife Sarah are going to have a child in about a year or so. And by the way, they're in their 90s. Abraham's in his 90s, and Sarah's in her 60s. And with Sarah's listening at the tent, and she laughs. It's like, yeah, right, like that's going to happen with me and my old man. There's some interesting stuff in these stories. I'm telling you, you need to read these. But sure enough, before too long, Sarah has a bun in the oven, so to speak. She finds out she is indeed pregnant, and the story ends with a miraculous child being brought forth. Their son Isaac is born. Now, there's another story of a woman, an aging woman, who dearly desires to have a child. Her name is Hannah. And she goes to the temple to pray and promises that if God would give her a child, she would dedicate him to God's service. And sure enough, Hannah conceives, has a male child, and so she then, after he is weaned, brings the young child Samuel to the temple, along with an offering that included, get this, a 3-year-old bull, a skin of wine, and 3 measures of flour. There's that phrase again, the exact same phrase that Jesus uses in his parable, and one that would ring in the ears of his listeners. Finally, and this time the story involves a man, there's the story of Gideon, who led a very small group of about 300 soldiers into a major battle against an enemy army that numbered in the thousands. And on the night before the battle, Gideon prepares an offering to God that included a calf and some bread made with 3 measures of flour. That meal is consumed by fire from heaven, and the next day Gideon's band kicked the Midianite army back to where they came from. And it's a story of a big, big result from a very small beginning. Are we beginning to see a theme here? And are we realizing just how subtle and subversive Jesus really is in telling these stories? The kingdom of heaven may be a small thing in this world. Our culture is not particularly known for being overly concerned about God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. But Jesus could be saying it is something that's going to break forth. It's going to be delivered, if you will, in a big, big way. 60 pounds of flour is enough for an extravagant banquet, the kind Jesus told his followers that God was planning. And the generosity envisioned in God's good idea for the world is no one who's hungry, plenty to go around for everybody. Give us this day our daily bread. And so it seems that Jesus' ideas about heaven aren't so much about the sweet by and by with robes and harps and angel wings and people walking on golden streets, but rather much more about baking bread in a communal oven in a small village in the Galilean countryside where everyone has enough to eat. And the topic of the day might well be, as Jerry Clower used to say, well, ain't God good? Yeah. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on Dinner with Jesus. Dinner with Jesus is produced in the studios of the Lectionary Lab. Written and performed by John Fairless. Our Bible narration is by Jane Trevor.